Hello and welcome to this webinar, the first in a series of 3 webinars related to sustainability. Today's webinar is 1 hour long and it will be a presentation by Thomas Hylland Eriksson on a specific topic that we have selected for you. The webinar is organized by the Nordic Network for Adult Learning, NVL. So before we leave the room for Thomas, let me give you a few words about what the NVL is all about and why we have selected to organize and offer such a webinar as this series here. It all started with the fact that the Nordic Council of Ministers, who is funding NVL, set out a new strategy, a new vision for how the Nordic region should be, what it should be like in 2030. It's called Vision 2030, and it states very ambitiously that the Nordic region should be the most sustainable and integrated region in the world. That is a very high level aim to reach for, but it also means that it helps the Nordic cooperation organizations, programs, funders to have a joint focus, something that we share as an idea where we want to go, what we want to accomplish in the Nordic cooperation that we have. The vision is 3 parts, and I won't read everything here. You will get the PowerPoint afterwards, but the 3 part of sustainability is what I wanted to point out. And that means the sustainability in the view of the Nordic Council of Ministers, and thereby also for NVL, is 3-sided. It is not solely sustainability related to environment. It's also sustainability related to social integration and employability and a working life that functions in accordance with the common guidelines and approved ideas what we want to accomplish. So we need to look wider when we talk about sustainability than some people sometimes do when they think or consider sustainability to be only related to environment issues. Of course, it's an important issue, but it is also related to other issues. If we only take care of the environment and we don't care about the social integration, we will have a serious problem. And likewise, if we work on social integration but skip environment, we won't have a planet to live on. So these 3 all relate to one another, and they are all important, equally important, to reach the goals and the vision. The NVL network works with over 50% of its activities is in cooperation with other actors, such as many of those of you who are here today. If you haven't yet heard of NVL, or if you haven't yet worked together with NVL and some of the topics that NVL is working on is of interest to you, we invite you to contact us and suggest all levels of cooperation. The NVL work is connected through and works through thematic networks. This webinar today is organized by the Network for Sustainability, and that's one of the 12 active networks we currently have. All the networks are Nordic at level, so it means they have participants from all the Nordic countries. And all the work that NVL undertakes, funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers, has to have a high relevance for the stakeholders, which means you. It must be based on a need which is identified. It cannot be something we just think of that would be nice to do. And it also has to give an added value through Nordic cooperation. In other words, it should be something that wouldn't have been done otherwise. In a nutshell, that is the prerequisite, the reason for existence for NVL as an organization and as a network. The networks are independent from one another, and they all work on thematic areas, as I just said, but many of them intersect and correlate with one another and work on things similar to one another. Ideally, they help by combining the forces to accomplish things within specific thematic areas like validation, sustainability, guidance, and so on. And this year, all the networks have started a process of looking at how sustainable they are and how they work towards the Vision 2030. This is coordinated by the Network for Sustainability. This webinar today, on the 6th of May 2020, is the starting point for our work towards a Nordic conference in Malmö, 22nd of September, that focuses on sustainability and around the vision of sustainability of 2030, which I just previously explained to you. You will all be invited to that event. If we can keep it a physical event, we don't know yet. We are planning as if we can. We will have to see what happens with the corona situation, obviously, but at the moment, we are planning for this to happen. And registrations is already open. Within this link to this recording that you will get after we have published it on YouTube, you will also get this presentation where you get the link to the registration form and the program for the seminar. That is, in a nutshell, the reason why we have organized this webinar and what we hope to accomplish. We will give you some guidelines later on when it comes to allowing you and encouraging you to participate in a discussion, give you some questions. But now I'd like to give the floor open to Kirsten Paby from the Network of Sustainability to introduce today's speaker and the topic we're going to be talking about.
Thank you very much, Johanne. As you said, this webinar is a warming up to the conference in September. And planning this conference in times of COVID-19 led to the decision that we will open the conference with an interactive session in the format of a warm data lab. And we will ask the following to all the participants. How does the Nordic landscape look like? How do we reorientate our work based on the pandemic we are laying behind us or we are still in? We do not know. So which transformative powers do we see? How do we act constructively to the cracks that we experience in our Nordic countries and communities? Which room of opportunities do we see when it comes to us as adult educators? No one could be better to warm up and inspire this question than you, Thomas. We are very, very happy that you're not in Prague as you had planned to be and that you could join us today. When you and I discussed the title of the webinar, From Vulnerability to Sustainability, we agreed to put a question mark in the end. Because we do not know. The window is open. Can we identify opportunities for a more sustainable life after the crisis? Or in your article lately in the Norwegian magazine Agenda, you are quoting Margaret Thatcher, who once said, there is no alternatives. Your approach in this time of crisis is there are many alternatives. So please, Thomas, the online floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kirsten, and thanks very much to Johanne also for the introduction. And it strikes me that, you know, NVL is also not going to be the same afterwards. I mean, your aims to build sustainability in the sectors of the environment, society, the economy, it is now being rephrased, it will be refocused, and we will be talking about the near future and probably the distant future in a different way, because we have to realize that as we sit here scattered around the Nordic countries and possibly elsewhere, we are living through a moment of world history. You know, the changes have taken place at a tremendous speed. Only 2 months ago, things seemed as if they were sort of normal. Nobody really had predicted the situation that appeared, that emerged by mid-March when we experienced a global lockdown. So it's a big drama. The title from vulnerability to sustainability is something that I cooked up in connection with an application for research money that I wrote nearly 2 months ago. Still waiting for an answer, might be getting it tomorrow. The thing is that at the time, my idea seemed quite original. You know, I wanted to do a comparative study of how people respond in different parts of the world. So I teamed up with colleagues from other countries, China, Italy, and a couple of other places, to investigate how people were seeing this situation. Obviously, it's a moment of crisis, it's a moment of uncertainty, and for many people, a moment of precarity in a very material, economic way. And at the same time, as Kirsten mentioned, there is a window of opportunity now. We're living through a liminal phase, as we say in anthropology, a phase which is between something and something else, where you are both this and that, but really neither this nor that, where you can see your own society from the outside, and you can ask yourself, and you can ask of your surroundings, some critical questions about the way we lead our lives and the way we organize our societies. And as a matter of fact, there will be no return to the pre-corona, as it were, state of the world for the foreseeable future. Too many parts of the economy have collapsed. There is too much uncertainty. There are simply too many open-ended questions that continue to be raised. And we get new messages and new perspectives almost every day. So as a social scientist, I find this a very exciting time to live. Obviously, it's frightening. There's uncertainty, there's fear, and there is misery. And yet, at the same time, it's exciting, precisely because it enables us to understand society in a different way, and perhaps to come up with some alternative ways in which we could organize a better, more sustainable world society in the near future. There is no time in this short talk, but maybe during the discussion, to talk about the way in which the coronavirus crisis helps us understand the nuts and bolts of globalization. I think to many of us, these were more or less invisible for most of the time. We didn't think much about the way in which our own private, personal lives were interconnected through innumerable filaments of connections with the rest of the world, and how a small event in a fairly big but not that famous Chinese city, in the space of just a few weeks, it led to lockdown. Air traffic went down by more than 90%. People who ran little cafes went bankrupt. Millions of Americans were suddenly unemployed, and so on. In other words, what we lived through was what you could call a butterfly effect of globalization. The metaphor of the butterfly effect is taken from, really, it's just a story. I mean, it's an allegory, okay? A butterfly somewhere in Brazil flaps its little wings. It generates a very weak stream of air, very weak. It's just a tiny butterfly, okay? But that little stream of air connects to another slightly larger stream of air that it, prods, as it were, in a new direction. And before you know it, these little currents have connected to larger winds further up in the atmosphere and have led to a hurricane in the Caribbean. That's a butterfly effect. How big effects can come from very small causes. And in this global interconnected world, this can happen all the time. We could talk more about that during the discussion if you're interested, but I have to move on because there's limited time and we have other things to do. As a footnote, it seems to me that we are now getting used to communicating in this way. There are some obvious disadvantages, but there are also some obvious advantages. It may well be that this meeting would not have been organized, not even on a different subject, had it not been for the fact that we are now forced to communicate electronically. And we may slowly be getting the hang of it, although there is nothing like being in the same room together. There are some obvious advantages, and I'm coming to those afterwards, some obvious advantages to electronic communication. Now, so there's a global crisis. There's no doubt about it. Economic, and also at the level of personal lives. People's mobility has been restricted owing to the fairly severe lockdown regulations that they have that they are practicing in nearly every country in the world, with the exception of a few outliers, such as Belarus and Turkmenistan. In Turkmenistan, the president has simply banned the use of the word coronavirus. So, in effect, the coronavirus cannot exist in Turkmenistan because there's no word for it. But apart from very few outliers, most countries in the world have implemented many of the same measures in order to try to contain the virus and to restrict its spread. So that's one of the interesting things, how you could travel to, or you could find out about Bolivia, you could find out about Australia or Zimbabwe, and you'll find that authorities are trying to manage and contain the virus in very comparable ways. And again, as a footnote, it's interesting to look at the way in which previous pandemics were being contained, or rather how authorities attempted to contain them in the past. Very similar measures, border controls, quarantines, isolation of people who were suspected of having been infected. We've known this at least since the Black Death in the Middle Ages as ways of trying to contain the spread of a virus. It's more difficult now, owing to the interconnectedness of the world, but we also know more, and we have more advanced medical expertise. So in other words, there's human suffering on a large scale. People have lost their livelihoods. People who were already poor have become even poorer. People who barely had enough to support their families can no longer do so. Families in countries like Bangladesh and the Philippines who relied on remittances from relatives who were working overseas suddenly have seen the supply of money drying out. And those people who were working overseas are virtually imprisoned in their barracks. So it's not fun. Nobody can say that it's fun. Yet at the same time, there is a striking dimension here. The first piece of positive news, I think, about the coronavirus that I saw was an image from the sky in Wuhan, this big Chinese city where it probably all began, in the wet market, where for the first time people could draw their breath in relief because the air was suddenly breathable. The air pollution had gone down dramatically. And a few weeks later, photos that circulated in the international press from cities like New Delhi, capital of India, infamous for its smog, showed that, in fact, for the first time, for a very long time, people in New Delhi could see that the sky was blue, because they hadn't noticed before, because there had always been smog. So the entire world has been forced to slow down, and the economy of the world has cooled down dramatically overnight. And this is something that climate researchers, environmental activists, and certain far-seeing politicians have been promoting for many years. Climate researchers have said for 30 years that we've got to do something, otherwise things are going to look very bad in the middle of the 21st century, if not earlier. Environmental activists have pointed to the fact that we have killed off more than half of the wild animals, more than half of the vertebrates in less than 50 years. Today, only 4% of the mammals in the world are wild. 36% are human, and the remaining 60% are livestock. And in order to keep those livestock going, we have to cut down a lot of rainforest for pastures and to grow soybeans so that they can get some protein-rich fodder in the European winter, and so on. So the situation for the environment and for climate has been dismal and deteriorating very quickly for a very long time. Just take such a phenomenon like air travel. It's not the main cause of climate change, but it is one significant contributor to climate change. Between 2004 and 2019, the number of trips taken by plane more than doubled. The number of tickets sold to people from about 2 billion to 4.5 billion in 15 years. And now, in the space of just 2 months, it's been reduced by more than 90%. Is this good news or bad news? Depends on how you choose to look at it. And take a phenomenon like private consumption. There has been a concern, and certainly in our Nordic part of the world, where we try to be as sustainable as we can, although we're not very good at it. But there has been a concern that we consume too much. We buy too much stuff. We eat too much meat. We travel too much. We could have done the same things, possibly, but just much less. And now we do all of these things much less. Economists estimate that as much as 2/3 of the global economy is accounted for by private or domestic consumption. 2/3 of the world economy, domestic consumption. And when domestic consumption goes down by more than half, it's a good thing for the environment, but it's a very bad thing for the people who rely on those jobs, and certainly for the corporations who own those jobs. Okay, so let me move quickly on to the final part of the talk. What are the options? So in other words, we have been forced to cool down, to slow down. Finally, we seem to be reaching some of the goals of the climate agreements. We seem to be on the way to reach some of the goals of the climate agreement, but at a cost. And we see the cost in a brutal way, not least in the global south, where people who were already poor and precarious have been thrust into even more serious poverty. What are our options? I'll run through them very quickly, and then we'll move on to a discussion. First of all, governments are going to need a lot of money to reconstruct their societies, to rebuild, to simply to keep the wheels going. So what about a more radical indirect taxation on consumption, which is connected to the environmental footprint, carbon footprint? So in other words, buy sustainably, it's cheap. Buy unsustainably, it's going to be expensive. If you really have to go to Thailand on holiday, you can do so, but it's going to cost you $50,000. I know the objections. There is a class dimension, an inequality dimension, and we're going to have to deal with that, but that's a separate question. It's not really an objection against the principle that you should pay for your own filth, for your own pollution. So that could provide a bit of money into impoverished government coffers. Secondly, we've got to reduce our consumption. Carbon-free economy is probably not on the cards, not yet, and it's going to take a long time. But we can reduce our consumption and thereby reduce our carbon footprint. But when we reduce our consumption, like travel and buying stuff and buying services and so on, many people are going to lose their jobs, and they already have. And that is exactly one of the points that we need to take very seriously, because people need something meaningful to do. So we should then move on to rethinking work, rethink productivity. Many have proposed UBI, Universal Basic Income, as a possibility, and in fact as something which seems to be more on the cards, more relevant now than it has been before, because so many people don't seem to have anything to do, and may not have so for the foreseeable future. But I would move further than that. Yes, UBI is fine, but it's not going to solve the problem of having something to do for the workers of the world. So we should rethink work. What is work, and what is the economy? Is the economy mainly a means to generate enormous wealth for people who were already absurdly rich, okay? Which is to some extent the situation now? Or should the economy rather be seen as a means to satisfy human needs? Not all human needs, but some fairly basic human needs. The need to make a living, the need to take part in a broader context, the need to contribute, which are basic human needs. If this sounds utopian, let me remind you of a couple of things. First of all, something has to be done now. I'm not Lenin, who famously said something has to be done. Okay, what needs to be done? But something has to be done with the way in which we produce and the way we live. Secondly, these ideas are not new. In fact, early feminists maintained and argued that domestic work should be considered work. It should not be considered, something that you just do, even though it was unpaid. So a lot of the things that we do already, which are unpaid, could be voluntary work. but also a lot of the things that we don't do, which don't seem to be profitable, could now be entered into the mainstream economy. And as a result, we will then begin to rethink the values on which society build. What's the point of having a society? What's the point of living? I'm not saying what's the meaning of life, but nearly. What is it that makes for a fulfilling, rich life? Perhaps it isn't consumption. Perhaps it isn't even conventional wage work. Perhaps it's something else that makes life meaningful. So in other words, we can now begin to plan for, and we have to plan for, that's a silver lining here, isn't it? But we have to plan for a society which is slower, which is globalized in a different way. We cannot afford to relinquish the connections that we have, the global connections that we have, but we can try to make them more humanly and ecologically sustainable in the future. I mean, Zoom meetings are fairly sustainable compared to a lot of other things, compared to container ships. And they contribute to this global conversation in a wonderful way. We've had the opportunity for a long time to have global meetings on platforms like this one, but we haven't really taken that opportunity until now, and now we're learning it. And I think that's going to continue. So slower societies, smaller scale, a cooled down world in every respect. And that might even not mainly entail sacrifices, but the reevaluation of the values on which society builds, and perhaps at the end of the day, a better quality of life, and certainly a better quality of life for our grandchildren. On that note, I end, and I'm looking forward to your objections and viewpoints and questions. So thank you.
The breakout rooms. Thomas, the first question was, can you say something more about the butterfly effect for transitions for a just and sustainable system?
Yeah, I saw that, and that question has also been rephrased. Yeah, it's a big challenge, and I think we should not underestimate the potential of doing things on a small scale. One may always feel powerless. I mean, I think many who have an environmental engagement, for example, they feel powerless because I cannot save, the glaciers of Greenland or the tropical glaciers or the Andes or I can't stop the certification in India and so on. And you probably can't, but you can do something where you are. And if everybody does the best where they are, the result will be systemic change. And this can spread epidemically, just like the pandemic, because of globalization, new ideas, new initiatives. And we have quite a number of, might say, best practices in terms of the environment that show that it can work. The tendencies that we see can be reversed. So by all means, we should think along those lines and not just wait for someone up there, the powerful corporations or politicians, to do the right thing, because they may never do so. So it may well be that change will have to come from below, from civil society, from grassroots organizations, from trade unions, from student networks and so on. And if we look at changes that have taken place in the past, which have been fairly dramatic, the end of slavery. Nobody in the 18th century, really believed that slavery would end. It was so necessary economically. I mean, the wheels would stop turning and people would go bankrupt and so on. And the world would be thrust into a disastrous situation. And then just a handful of people started to, think about the ways in which they could campaign to their politicians in Parliament in England. 12 people started, 12 men actually, in the late 18th century. And after 20 years, they'd managed to abolish the slave trade. And after another 30 years, all the slaves were liberated in the British and French colonies. And we can think of other examples. You can think of the indigenous movement. We just laughed at. And now indigenous groups, in fact, at least in some parts of the world, have recognition. They have their own representatives in the United Nations, and they have organizations and so on and so forth. Or women's voting rights. Third example, also laughed at by the cynics and conservatives at the time, because women were so scatterbrained and irrational. I mean, they could never, play a part in politics, and they should be kept at home, basically. And after, just about 20, 30 years, it seemed unthinkable that women shouldn't have been able to vote. So things can change
Thomas,
quite quickly. Yes.
The examples you're given are within a system. Yes, they might have be considered threatened to the patriarchy or to the powers that be, but they did not threaten to overturn the whole system. And the way you gave your speech was a little bit revolutionary. So one question in this chat was, in order to make those things happening, what you're mentioning, don't we have to abandon the current capitalist system?
Yes, if we emphasize the term current, I would certainly agree. And yes, clearly global capitalism, global neoliberal capitalism is part of the problem because it's so short-sighted, there is no accountability, and it leads to what in my research I call overheating effect, which could be summarized as accelerated change where there is no governor, there's no thermostat, there's no instance which can control the system, which can contain it, which can tell that people that it's enough now, it's fast enough, it's big enough, it's warm enough, we have to cool down and slow down. There's no such instance. So it's very dangerous in that sense. And if you look at some of the indicators of growth, just in the last 30 years, they all look like this. They're all exponential. The growth in tourism, the amount of plastic waste in the oceans, even energy consumption is going up. We still rely on more than 90% of our energy consumption globally is from fossil fuels. So yes, I would say that market principles are a good idea in order to regulate the economy, but very dangerous when they're let loose on the world society. And when the market principle is all you have left to regulate society, when there are no other values. So we should probably think more in terms of a human economy than a growth-oriented economy. So the problem is global capitalism. The problem is growth.
Yeah, then you said that there are things we can change and things that we cannot so easily change. And those things that we can change related to the butterfly effect are those which are closer to us and nearer to us, where we are active in our surroundings, in our networks, in our work, with our interests. NVL works with learning, adults learning, and adult education. So in your point of view, and that's a question also from one of the participants, what could be the role of adult education in this process to be facilitator of this change?
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. Not only what people learn at school, but also what you learn after you've left school. It's incredibly important because it gives you tools, it gives you a vocabulary, and it gives you concepts with which to think about the world. And far too often we are being taught that we live in the best of possible worlds. And in a certain way, yeah, I guess up here in the Nordic countries, in a way we do. We have better health, we have better life expectancy, we have more opportunities, to realize our full potential than any other human population have ever had, but at a cost. And it's almost like a Faustian pact because we don't really care about the rest of the world, where things are going quite badly, not least in terms of pollution and the environment. But we also don't think much about those who come after us, the Greta Thunberg generation, the people who have less invested in the system and who see that something is fundamentally wrong because we're really digging our own grave, we're painting ourselves into a corner. So adult education can contribute by giving us new visions, new ideas, and this is the time to do it, simply precisely because there is a real need in the establishment of society as well to rethink some of the fundamentals of our society. And if I may be so free as just to comment briefly on another question that came from Susan Guerra in the...
Yeah, that would be my next question, so please go ahead.
Yeah, great. So how can we think about the criteria, the renewal of criteria or values for a human economy? I can't give the full lecture now. It's a big subject, and not least in anthropology, where on the one hand you have the neoliberal approach to the economy, which is about generating profit for corporations very much. And on the other hand, you have the ideas from the human economy, where the economy is seen as being embedded in society. And it's not merely based on values that we tend to associate with economy, but it's based on a broader set of values to do with justice, to do with the quality of life, and to do with social responsibilities, and so on. Yeah, I mean, there's a big literature. Much of it is inspired by the economic historian Karl Polanyi. One of the leading lights today of human economy approaches is an anthropologist called Keith Hart, who's written about this. But there are also many others. You could think in terms of cooperatives. You can think in terms of collective ownership. You could also have a fully functioning market economy, but with some social restrictions on profitability. It would not be considered a good thing, for example, to stow away your money in the Cayman Islands. I mean, that would not be acceptable within the human economy, based on social values, not on profitability.
Thank you. That was so short and succinto, however you whatever, short, to the point. Thank you. There are not that many questions still in the chat, and now if you participants here in the webinar would like to open your mic and ask a question by audio, if you feel that to be easier, please write SP for speak in the chat so that we can give it the voiced one-on-one. Meanwhile, there is one question about, there is immediately from Judith. Please, Judith, turn on your microphone, and if you want your video, and ask your question.
Hello, everyone. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. My name is Judith Lloyd. I have for many years worked on the topic of education for sustainable development. So I think what we are talking about is now transformation, and this is really important. On the other hand, we could also use this network right now to do some short-term proposals. For example, using the pandemic changes that are happening to try to come up with smaller proposals. We can make a Twitter storm with this network saying that, okay, it's not only a pandemic crisis, we do have a climate crisis, a poverty crisis, keep staying home, no travel or something. Or we could also try to do sector for sector, saying that no university should ever fly again to a conference. Keep staying on Zoom. If we could do that as a network on a shorter term level, we could also go away from this fora and knowing that we have done a little small thing today. That's a proposal from me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's great. But let's just keep in mind, I mean, I'm sure that you and I share many of the same ideas about how we want to refashion our societies. Let's just keep in mind that it's not going to be easy. And one reason it's not going to be easy, if for example, we reduce travel, which I think we should. You know, we should travel less often and probably in a different way, and maybe stay longer. You know, and I seriously think that, you know, the era of the weekend trip to Prague or Rome is gone. It's not coming back anytime soon. Not only because of environmental concerns, but also because people are going to be worried about, you know, contagion. I mean, these airports and the tourist spots are, you know, they're really sort of distribution centers for virus diseases. So it's not coming back. So travel more slowly, perhaps, and so on. But let's keep in mind that tourism represents at least 10% of the world economy. And in some countries, they don't have a lot more. I'm continuously in contact with friends and colleagues in the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean, where I have some research projects going. And to them, you know, tourism is everything. So the recession that they are experiencing now is massive. It's almost, you know, it's hard to envision. Or take a country like Greece. 20% of the Greek economy is tourism. And they were just about to recover now from the last financial crisis. And now it's not going to happen. So we have to, my point is that there's no magic bullet. And in the short term, you know, it's important to help people keep their lives going in a meaningful way, while we at the same time think more long term about sustainability. And up here, less travel, probably work less. In our breakout group, we spoke a little bit about working hours. I mentioned universal basic income, and why do we continue to work 40 hours a week when it's not necessary? And especially now that we need to share the work among more people than before. Yeah. So maybe this is also the time to promote the 6-day, so the 6-hour day. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or maybe even 5.
Jeppe has asked for the floor. Please, Jeppe.
Yeah, hi. I think one thing that could be very interesting to hear you commenting on is that you can say that now we have the shock and many things are changing, but I think also some people are more ready to change than others. We are very diverse. We are not just one people like that. And then you can say, how can we as adult educators cope with the kind of conflict diversity in that probably will happen, because as you say, it is not just that we have a magic bullet and then everything changes. There would be a kind of reaction like we also saw after 2008 with the economic crisis, and there we actually got almost back to where we already were. So how do you think we can, what kind of institutions or how can education cope with these kind of dissensus, I would call it? Yeah.
Yes, thanks a lot. Yeah, great, big, difficult question. How can we deal with this dissent, with the disagreements, and with the tensions? Because quite clearly, I think we're now going to see in many of our societies around the world, and certainly in the Nordic world, a polarization, or at least a conflict between different views as to how we're going to go about things, where you will still have political and economic elites who will speak very sort of arrogantly and condescendingly to people like me who promote alternative ways and who emphasize ecological sustainability, because they would come with the figures, with the numbers, everything that they can measure, which shows that no, we have to return to business as usual as soon as possible. So we're going to have those tensions, but at least then we talk about serious stuff. Because these are some of the big issues that are confronting us. So keep them up in the open. I mean, have those discussions out in the open, and don't pretend that they don't exist. And then I'm not saying that the best argument is always going to win, but we should be optimistic. We should be positive and emphasize that, in fact, a sustainable future is going to be better for all of us. I mean, you're going to get a better life. And I believe that some of us have already had that experience during these nearly 2 months of very strange lockdown. Yes, I mean, there's a bad. You can't meet your friends in the way you used to. You can't go to a football game. You can't go out, and have a good time in a cafe. But there's also the good, which is sorry, my watch is trying to tell me something. And the good is that we've had a lot of slow time thrust upon us, slow time that we didn't think about before. And suddenly maybe some of us are starting to notice those little things that we tended to take for granted or ignored, such as the fact that there's spring outside. I mean, I bake a lot of bread these days. I listen to more music. You know, we can do these slow things which are carbon neutral and which contribute to creating the good life. So I would say that, why don't we start by asking, what is a good life? And then take it from there. Is a good life, to consume as much as possible and to make as much money as possible in some corporation or other and destroy nature and create more global inequality? Or, could it be something else? But it's important to get this conversation started and to be open about there being disagreements. I've sometimes borrowed the term from a sociologist up here who was looking at the culturally or ethnically diverse schools. And he came up with a concept of the community of disagreement, uenighetsfellesskap, which I think is a good place to start, because let's not pretend that everybody agrees, but at least we can have a conversation where all these disagreements can be put on the table, and we'll see how we can move ahead from there.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yes. I mean, we're talking in this discussion, as I hear it, from a very privileged perspective. We are talking about listening to more music. We are culturally, have a lot of cultural capital sitting here talking about all the good ideas. We enjoy nature, we have our money, we don't starve. I mean, there's something in all this discussion that I think, how can we support the fundament for it all being changed? I mean, if you have hunger, you have no food for your children, you have no education, it's very hard to be sustainable, even if it's necessary. I mean, even if you will probably die if you're not. So there's some key questions I think is underlying all these discussions, that how do we share the economy? more equally. I heard Piketty someday on the Copenhagen Docks bill. Very interesting view. And I think this inequality raising now, because it's the poorest people who are most suffering at the moment. We are sitting in our privileged homes. How can we also deal with this inequality?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think if we don't solve that, we will not solve.
Okay.
Or maybe that's wrong thinking, but that's a question.
Yes.
You get
yes,
a 1 minute
yep.
answer time, and then we will wrap up this webinar.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. And I believe I did touch upon that a few times when I pointed out that in fact there's no easy way out. And also there is no one size fits all sort of solution. But up here, where we are in this privileged, peaceful, wealthy, well-organized, stable corner of the world, there are certain things we can do here about the way we live and the way we organize our society. And there may be certain things we can contribute to others. And I cannot agree more than that this should be a main priority. But there are dilemmas all the time. I mean, look at, for example, Bangladeshi families who are now doing rather well as opposed to what they were in the 1970s when Bangladesh was just unbelievably poor. And it's now becoming a middle income country, partly because of child labor, partly because of those children who are making the cheap clothes that you can get at Hennes og Mauritz. So should we take those jobs away? I guess we should, but we should then also offer an alternative. So as I'm saying, there's no simple solution, but let's at least start where we are. Otherwise, we will give up before we started to even try. And the glass is always half full. It's never half empty.
Okay. We have come to the end of this webinar. We have run for 1 hour and 1 minute, and I, for one, like to keep time as well as I can. The point here was to start a discussion with you guys, to invite you to consider and to be perhaps a little bit provoked or to expand your horizons. And we thoroughly hope that you have gotten that from Thomas and from the breakout room discussions that you had. Some of you in the chat wrote it was too short. Well, that's a good thing. Then you were not bored and we got your juices flowing and your ideas starting. And that's as much as you can hope for in a 1 hour event. Now, before we go, a last slide. What's going to happen next?
Can I just say something very shortly, that we will, in the Network for Sustainable Development, we will collect all the things that come up, because we want to continue this series of webinars, so the discussion will continue. So, and I also want to say thank you to you, Thomas. So that was just some.
Thank you. We will have another webinar in this series in August of 2020, beginning middle August. You will get the invitation and the link to registration as soon as we have it up. It will be based on the everyday life in a folk high school. What does this transformation, this way of thinking about sustainability and living sustainability mean in a practical sense? And how does that affect life in a folk high school? That webinar will be held in one of the Scandinavian languages, because we are switching between English and Scandinavian languages. If that's not a problem for you, if you can follow in Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, we very much invite you to join that webinar and to tip all your friends, all your colleagues, and everybody else who might be interested about that webinar, as well as the recording of Thomas's presentation that we will put on YouTube, published this week, and send you all the link to so that you can share and use as a basis for your discussions. As Kirsten said, the work has only just started in NVL Sustainability Network. All the things that you said today, all the discussions, all the proposals, all the ideas will be taken on board and discussed within NVL. So thank you very much for your feedback. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here today, taking the 1 hour off for doing this. And thank you very much, Thomas, for a presentation that for me was very invigorating and also very full of hope, very full of forward-looking and not backward-looking at all the problems that we all know exist. It's not a question that they don't exist. It's a question, what do we do about it, in my opinion? With
And
that,
on behalf of the network, thank you so much also to you, Johanni, for doing this smoothly.